There is a book that, by all ordinary measures, should have vanished. It spoke of angels who crossed a forbidden line, of giants born into a wounded world, of heavenly secrets carried down to earth, not as blessings, but as contamination. For centuries, the Book of Enoch was known, quoted, argued over, and then, across much of Jewish and Christian tradition, it slipped outside the boundaries of the Bible, but it did not die. It survived at the edge of the map, preserved in Ethiopia, waiting for a world that had almost forgotten it. And when it returned, it brought questions with it. Not only about angels, but about power, memory, and the dangerous life of forbidden knowledge. To understand why this book became so magnetic, we have to move slowly. Not as treasure hunters chasing a convenient secret, but as investigators following a text through survival, rejection, rediscovery, and legend. The stranger truth is that Enoch does not need a conspiracy to be unsettling. Its survival is already unusual enough. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe, so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. And as we begin, leave a comment letting us know where in the world you are watching from tonight. It's a reminder of how far these forgotten echoes can reach. The Book of Enoch occupies a peculiar place in the imagination. It is ancient, but not safely distant. Religious, but not comfortably contained. It speaks in visions, judgments, cosmic journeys, and accusations against powers too high to touch. Later legends would tie it, cautiously and often without firm evidence, to the Knights Templar and the dream of hidden wisdom guarded in secret. But before the Templars, before medieval rumors, before modern obsession, there was the book itself, a surviving witness from a world where heaven felt close, dangerous, and watching. Chapter 2, A Bible Outside the Bible. The first mistake people often make with the Book of Enoch is imagining it as one neat, forbidden volume, hidden away like a locked object in a temple vault. It is stranger than that. The Book of Enoch is not a simple book in the modern sense. It is a collection, a layered body of ancient apocalyptic writing gathered around the figure of Enoch, a man who appears only briefly in Genesis, but whose brief appearance seems almost designed to provoke curiosity. The biblical text says that Enoch walked with God, and then he was not, because God took him. It is one of those sentences that opens a door and refuses to tell you what is on the other side. Later imagination stepped through that door. In Enochic tradition, this mysterious ancestor becomes far more than a name in a genealogy. He becomes a witness, a traveler, a scribe of heaven, a human being allowed to see what ordinary people cannot see. The hidden architecture of creation, the punishment prepared for rebellious angels, the movements of the stars, the moral order behind history, and the terrible certainty that injustice will not remain unanswered forever. That is part of what makes the book so powerful. It does not merely say that the world is corrupt. It tries to explain corruption as something woven into a cosmic drama. Human violence is not only human violence. Tyranny is not only politics. Moral collapse is not just social decay. Behind it all, Enoch imagines a universe where heavenly beings have violated their boundaries, where knowledge has been mishandled, and where the visible world bears the marks of an invisible rebellion. This is why calling it a Bible outside the Bible is useful, but also slightly misleading. For most Jewish and Christian traditions, The Book of Enoch did not become part of the accepted biblical canon. It lived in the margins, quoted or respected by some, rejected or avoided by others. Yet in the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition, it survived with a status far closer to Scripture. So the book exists in an unusual tension. To many readers, it feels biblical in tone, age, and ambition. But historically, its authority was never accepted in the same way everywhere. That tension is important, because the story of Enoch is not simply the story of a text being suppressed, as modern legend sometimes likes to imagine. Canon formation was slower, messier, and more human than that. Communities preserved the books they believed carried authority, coherence, and spiritual usefulness. They also argued about texts that felt too speculative, too difficult, or too dangerous in the wrong hands. Enoch belonged to that unstable category, influential enough to echo through later religious thought, but unsettling enough to remain contested. And what did it contain? Visions of heaven, warnings of judgment, angelic names and hierarchies, cosmic journeys across impossible landscapes, scenes in which the world is measured, recorded, and morally weighed. It is full of books within books, secrets revealed and sealed, messages delivered across the border between earth and heaven. Its imagination is vast, but not decorative. The visions serve a purpose. They insist that history is not random, that suffering is seen, that corrupt powers are temporary, and that even angels are not beyond judgment. That last idea is one of the book's sharpest edges. In many religious imaginations, angels belong safely above humanity. They are messengers, protectors, flames of obedience. But in Enoch, some angels become offenders. Not tragic rebels in a romantic sense, but beings who cross a line and damage the human world by doing so. The scandal is not merely that they sin. It is that their sin teaches humanity new ways to destroy itself. This gives the Book of Enoch its particular atmosphere. It is not only mystical, it is suspicious. Suspicious of power, suspicious of knowledge without wisdom, suspicious of beauty when used as manipulation, science when used without conscience, authority when it forgets accountability. The book seems to ask a question that still feels uncomfortably modern. What happens when intelligence advances faster than morality? That may be one reason it never quite disappears from the imagination. A text can be excluded from a canon and still remain influential. It can be left outside the official room and still press its face against the window. Enoch did that for centuries. Its ideas moved through early Jewish apocalyptic thought, through certain strands of Christian interpretation, through legends about demons and fallen angels, through later fascination with hidden books and secret wisdom. Sometimes the influence is direct. Sometimes it is more like a family resemblance, a shared atmosphere of judgment, rebellion, and revelation. But before we follow those echoes, we have to enter the part of the book that made Enoch unforgettable: the descent. The moment when heaven's watchers look down at the human world, and the boundary between the divine and the earthly begins to break. Chapter 3. The Watchers Descend. The story that made the Book of Enoch famous begins with a gaze, not a battle, not a prophecy, not a king hearing a voice in the night. It begins with heavenly beings looking down at the earth and desiring what they see. In the Enochic account, these beings are called the Watchers. The name itself is unsettling because it suggests distance, duty, and surveillance. They are not supposed to enter the human story as participants. They are supposed to observe, to guard, to remain within the order assigned to them. But the boundary does not hold. The Watchers descend to earth, take human wives, and from these unions come the Nephilim, giants, violent beings whose presence turns the world into something heavier, more brutal, and more difficult to recognize. This is not presented as a romantic crossing between worlds. Enoch does not treat it as a beautiful myth about heaven touching earth. It is a transgression, a rupture, a crime with consequences that spread outward. What makes this story so disturbing is not only the presence of fallen angels. Many traditions have stories of divine or semi-divine beings misbehaving. The sharper idea in Enoch is that the corruption of the world begins when those entrusted with higher knowledge abandon restraint. The Watchers do not merely break a rule for themselves. They drag humanity into the aftermath. That detail changes the whole meaning of the tale. In a simpler moral story, humans fall because humans are weak. They choose violence. They choose vanity. They choose power. Enoch does not deny human responsibility, but it widens the frame. It suggests that human history has been contaminated by forces older and stronger than human society. Civilization is not innocent, but neither is it alone. The wound is cosmic. The descent of the Watchers also explains why the Book of Enoch has always attracted readers who feel that official explanations are too small. It gives mythic shape to a suspicion many cultures have carried in different forms, that something went wrong very early, that knowledge arrived before wisdom, that human beings inherited more than they understood. But we should be careful here. The Watchers are not evidence of a hidden prehistoric science. They are not a neat code for aliens, lost civilizations, or secret bloodlines, though modern interpretations often try to force them into those shapes. The Enochic imagination is working in a religious and moral language. Its concern is not technological wonder. Its concern is disorder. The question is not, what advanced secret did they bring? The question is, what happens when sacred boundaries are violated by those who should know better? That is a much darker question, because it does not depend on proving a modern theory. It belongs to every age. The Watchers gather, and according to the tradition, they understand that what they are about to do is forbidden. This is not an accident. It is not a misunderstanding. They bind themselves together, sharing the guilt so that no one can turn back alone. There is something painfully human in that image, even though the beings are not human. The group making the crime feel possible. The oath turning hesitation into momentum. From there, the story becomes almost unbearable in its scale. The children born from these unions are not merely unusual. They become a sign that the world's proportions have been broken. The Nephilim consume, dominate, and spread violence. Their size matters less than what they represent. Appetite without limit. Strength without conscience. A distorted inheritance from heaven and earth together. In Enoch, the result is a world that cries out. This is one of the quiet truths behind the horror of the passage. The earth itself becomes a witness. The victims do not have enough power to correct the wrong done to them, so the crime rises upward into the hearing of heaven. Justice begins not because earthly rulers become wise, but because suffering can no longer be ignored. That idea would have mattered deeply to ancient communities living under empire, violence, and instability. Enoch offers an explanation for why the powerful seem untouchable, but it also denies that they are truly beyond reach. Even if the corruption began above humanity, judgment can reach higher still. The Watcher's descent, then, is not just an origin story for monsters. It is a story about failed guardians, about authority betraying its purpose, about those placed above the world becoming dangerous to the world. That may be why the myth has remained so adaptable. The beings change names from age to age, but the pattern is familiar. Institutions meant to protect become predatory. Knowledge meant to illuminate becomes a weapon. Power meant to serve begins to feed on what it was entrusted to guard. This is where Enoch becomes more than an ancient curiosity. Because the Watchers are frightening not simply because they are supernatural. They are frightening because they make corruption look organized. They do not stumble into evil as isolated figures. They descend together. They teach. They reproduce their disorder. They leave systems behind. And once forbidden knowledge enters the human world, it does not return quietly to heaven. It spreads through hands, tools, desires, rituals, and ambitions. It takes the shape of culture. It becomes difficult to separate gift from poison. That is where the next part of the Enochic vision begins. Not with the fall itself, but with what the fallen bring. Chapter 4. Knowledge that corrupts the world. The Watchers do not arrive empty-handed. That is what makes their descent so dangerous in the Book of Enoch. Their crime is not only desire, it is instruction. They bring knowledge into the human world. But the text does not celebrate this as enlightenment. It treats it as contamination, because the knowledge arrives without moral order. In the Enochic imagination, civilization itself begins to look suspicious. One Watcher teaches the making of weapons. Another teaches adornment and cosmetics. Others reveal enchantments, astrology, signs of the heavens, and hidden arts that humans were not meant to possess in that way, at that time, under those teachers. The list feels strange to a modern reader, because it mixes things we might separate into different categories: warfare, beauty, magic, science, seduction, calculation. But that mixture is the point. The Book of Enoch is not simply afraid of tools. It is afraid of knowledge severed from responsibility. A blade can defend, but it can also turn violence into craft. Adornment can be harmless, even beautiful. But in the text's moral universe, it becomes tied to deception and desire. Observation of the stars can lead to wonder, but it can also become a hunger to control fate. The problem is not that human beings learn. The problem is that they learn under fallen instruction from beings who have already betrayed the order they were meant to serve. That is a remarkably subtle idea for such an ancient and dramatic text. Enoch does not say that ignorance is holiness. It does not praise stupidity as innocence. Enoch himself is a figure of knowledge. He sees, records, travels, receives visions, and carries messages between worlds. So the book cannot be reduced to a warning against knowing too much. It is more precise than that. It asks what kind of knowledge is being offered, who is offering it, and what sort of human being it produces. That question still has teeth. Every age likes to believe its tools are neutral. We tell ourselves that the invention is innocent, and only the user gives it meaning. The Book of Enoch is less comfortable. It imagines knowledge as having a moral atmosphere. Some gifts arrive already bent by the intention of the giver. Some techniques do not merely serve society. They reshape society around appetite, fear, vanity, and domination. In the world of the Watchers, the forbidden arts do not remain private secrets whispered among a few initiates. They spread. Weapons multiply violence. Enchantments blur moral boundaries. The reading of signs becomes a way to grasp for control. Beauty becomes entangled with manipulation. Human beings become cleverer, but not wiser. More capable, but not more just. That is the catastrophe. The book is not describing a world that collapses because it lacks intelligence. It collapses because intelligence has been detached from reverence. It has skill without restraint, technique without humility, information without purification of the heart. In that sense, the Watcher's teachings are almost more frightening than the Nephilim themselves. Giants can die. A corrupt way of knowing can outlive the bodies that introduced it. This is where the story becomes uncomfortably close to civilization's own self-portrait. Many cultures tell origin stories that dignify their arts. The first metalworker, the first healer, the first astronomer, the first king, the first city. Enoch takes a colder look. What if some of the things civilization is proudest of were born in moral injury? What if progress can carry a stain? Not because making, studying, or adorning are evil in themselves, but because the human hunger to master the world can so easily outrun the discipline needed to live rightly within it. That is not a comfortable message, especially for modern viewers. We are trained to think of knowledge as automatically liberating, and often it is. Knowledge cures diseases, exposes lies, preserves memory, and gives the powerless language against the powerful. But Enoch belongs to a tradition that refuses to flatter knowledge simply because it is hidden, advanced, or impressive. A secret is not holy just because someone tried to keep it secret. A revelation is not good just because it feels forbidden. This matters when we later come to legends about lost books, hidden archives, and the Templars. The modern imagination often treats forbidden knowledge as treasure. Something suppressed must be valuable. Something hidden must be true. Something excluded must be dangerous to authority, and therefore liberating to us. The Book of Enoch complicates that instinct. In its own story, forbidden knowledge is not automatically salvation. It can be the very mechanism of ruin. That irony is easy to miss. People are drawn to Enoch because they imagine it as a forbidden book. But inside Enoch, forbidden teaching is precisely what wounds the world. The text becomes a mirror held up to its readers. Are we seeking wisdom, or merely the thrill of possessing what others were denied? Are we trying to understand the past, or are we repeating the Watcher's mistake by confusing hiddenness with holiness? The fallen angels teach, and humanity changes. But Enoch himself is not one of the eager students. He does not receive knowledge in order to dominate. He receives it as a burden. His role is not to turn secrets into power, but to carry testimony. He sees what others cannot see, and the seeing does not make him proud. It makes him responsible. That difference is everything. Because in the Book of Enoch, the world is not saved by ignorance, and it is not saved by forbidden arts. It is answered by witness. Someone must look at the damage clearly. Someone must record the crime without becoming intoxicated by the mystery. Someone must walk between earth and heaven and speak the truth to powers that have forgotten judgment. That someone is Enoch. Chapter 5. Enoch, the messenger between worlds. Enoch is not the loudest figure in the story. He does not descend with the Watchers. He does not raise armies against the giants. He does not stand at the center of a kingdom, issue commands, or build monuments to prove that he existed. His power is quieter, and in some ways more unusual. Enoch sees. Enoch records. Enoch carries messages between worlds that should not be casually crossed. In the Book of Enoch, this makes him one of the most cinematic figures in ancient religious imagination. A human being moving through landscapes no ordinary human is supposed to enter. The earth below is damaged by violence. The heavens above are ordered, immense and terrifying. Between them moves Enoch, not as a conqueror of secret knowledge, but as a witness summoned into a duty he did not invent. That distinction matters. The watchers seize what they desire. Enoch receives what he is shown. He becomes the opposite of the fallen angels. They cross downward in rebellion. He is carried upward in testimony. They teach in order to corrupt. He writes in order to remember. There is an elegant moral symmetry in that. The story does not answer forbidden knowledge with ignorance. It answers corrupted knowledge with accountable knowledge. Enoch's visions are not toys for the curious. They are records for judgment. This is why he is often imagined as a scribe. The scribe is not merely someone who writes things down. In an ancient world, the scribe guards memory against decay. A spoken accusation can be denied. A wounded community can be silenced. But a written record has a different kind of patience. It waits. It can outlive the people who wanted the matter forgotten. Enoch's task is to make the invisible case visible. When the watchers realize judgment is coming, they do not simply swagger into punishment. They are afraid. Their forbidden power has not made them secure. Their knowledge of heaven's order makes their guilt worse, not better. And so they turn to Enoch, asking him to petition on their behalf. It is one of the more striking reversals in the tradition. The beings who once stood above humanity now need a human messenger. They had crossed the boundary to take, teach, and dominate. Now they need someone still capable of standing before divine authority without their stain. Enoch becomes the courier of a rejected appeal, the bearer of words from fallen angels to the throne of judgment. There is something almost bureaucratic about it, and that makes it more chilling. Cosmic rebellion does not end in a burst of theatrical chaos. It produces a petition, a case, a verdict. The universe of Enoch is visionary, but it is also legal in its bones. Crimes are recorded. Sentences are pronounced. No rank is high enough to erase responsibility. Enoch's journey through heaven expands this idea. He is shown storehouses of winds, paths of stars, places of punishment, chambers of order, cosmic boundaries, and mysteries that turn the universe into something both beautiful and governed. These are not random wonders placed there to decorate the story. They show that creation has structure. The world may look broken from below, but from the heavenly perspective, there is measure, sequence, and accountability. For ancient readers living under disorder, that vision mattered. When earthly justice fails, imagination often climbs. Not to escape the world, but to ask whether the world has been seen by someone greater than its rulers. Enoch's ascent says yes. The tyrant may control the city gate. The violent may control the road. The corrupt judge may control the verdict in public. But above them, in the architecture of heaven, another record is being kept. This is not a small comfort. It is a radical one. It suggests that reality is deeper than visible power, that the final meaning of events is not decided by whoever holds authority for a season. The Book of Enoch speaks to people who know that the innocent can lose in history. It offers them a wider courtroom. But Enoch's role should not be mistaken for simple triumph. He is not wandering through heaven like a tourist taking in sacred scenery. His visions are heavy. To see more is to become responsible for more. The higher he travels, the more clearly he understands the seriousness of what has happened below. That is another reason Enoch remains compelling. He does not possess secret knowledge in the way later occult fantasies often imagine possession. As a private advantage, a hidden key, a way to rise above ordinary people. His knowledge isolates him. It gives him a burden of speech. He must tell the fallen that their petition will not be accepted. He must bear witness to coming judgment. He must return from cosmic places with news no guilty power wants to hear. In that sense, Enoch is less like a magician and more like a reluctant court reporter of the universe. He stands close enough to heaven to hear the verdict, and close enough to earth to understand the damage. That position between worlds gives the book much of its emotional force. Enoch is human, which means he belongs to the fragile world harmed by the Watchers. But he is also admitted into heavenly spaces, which means he can see the larger pattern behind the wound. He is not swallowed by either realm. He passes between them, carrying the one thing corruption fears most, an accurate record. And here the story touches something deeply human. Most wrongdoing depends on confusion, on the hope that time will blur the facts, on the belief that victims will be forgotten, documents lost, witnesses discredited, meanings twisted. Enoch stands against that erosion. He is memory sharpened into testimony. That may be why the figure of Enoch became so attractive to later seekers of hidden tradition. He represented access to the unseen, but also the authority of writing. A book attributed to Enoch feels, by its very premise, like a report smuggled back from beyond the limits of ordinary life. Yet the text itself is more disciplined than many of its later admirers. It does not invite us to collect secrets for the thrill of collection. It asks whether we are willing to see judgment as clearly as mystery. Because once Enoch has seen the heavens, the story cannot remain only about the past. The descent of the Watchers leads toward a future reckoning. The corrupted world is not merely explained, it is summoned. And the witness between worlds becomes the voice announcing that even the highest offenders will not remain beyond judgment. Chapter 6, A Vision of Judgment. The Book of Enoch is often remembered for its angels. That is understandable. Fallen watchers, forbidden teachings, giants in a ruined world. These are the images that seize the imagination first. They are vivid, strange, and easy to detach from the rest of the work. But if we stop there, we miss the deeper engine of the book. Enoch is not mainly interested in spectacle. It is interested in judgment. The visions do not exist simply to make heaven look vast or the unseen world feel exotic. They are arranged around a moral claim that corruption is temporary, even when it appears ancient, powerful, and protected. The Watchers may come from above. Violent rulers may dominate below. The world may seem to reward those who seize, consume, and conceal. But in Enoch's universe, nothing escapes being recorded. That is the pressure beneath the text. It imagines reality as a place where hidden crimes have weight. They do not dissolve just because the powerful deny them. They do not disappear because victims die before justice arrives. Somewhere beyond the visible machinery of courts and kingdoms, the truth has been preserved with frightening accuracy. For communities living under oppression, this kind of vision was not abstract theology. It was a way of surviving morally when the world looked morally insane. Apocalyptic writing often emerges where ordinary history feels unbearable. Not always, and not in a simple one-to-one way, but often enough to matter. When people cannot easily overthrow violent power, they imagine a horizon beyond it. When the present is controlled by kings, empires, priests, landlords, armies, or corrupt judges, the apocalyptic imagination asks whether the present is really the final courtroom. Enoch answers no. Its judgment is not gentle, because the crimes it describes are not gentle. The fallen angels are bound. The violent are exposed. The arrogant discover that height is not safety. The world that seemed abandoned is revealed to have been under observation all along. This can sound harsh to modern ears, especially if judgment is heard only as punishment. But in Enoch, judgment is also the restoration of meaning. It is the moment when the universe stops pretending that victims and predators are morally equivalent. It separates what history has mixed together. That is why the imagery matters. The book shows places prepared for punishment, cosmic divisions, heavenly books, and angelic agents carrying out decisions that no earthly authority can negotiate away. These scenes are not just supernatural decoration. They create a world in which moral order has geography. There are boundaries. There are appointed times. There are consequences. The Watcher's story begins with a boundary being crossed. The vision of judgment answers by showing that boundaries still exist. That is one of the central tensions of Enoch. The world has been damaged, but not finally dissolved. Disorder is real, but it is not ultimate. Evil may spread through bodies, teachings, weapons, and institutions, but the book refuses to grant evil the dignity of permanence. There is a sober intelligence in that refusal. Enoch does not pretend that justice is obvious. If justice were obvious, there would be no need for visions. The text knows that earthly life can make wrongdoing look victorious. It knows that corrupt power can become ordinary, even respectable. It knows that violence can build cities and call itself order. So the book does something daring. It relocates true judgment outside the reach of those who control public reality. The powerful may write decrees. Heaven writes records. This idea helps explain why Enochic themes echoed so strongly in later religious imagination. The notion of heavenly books, final judgment, condemned angels, and a world awaiting correction gave language to people who felt history had not told the truth. It also gave shape to a longing that appears again and again in religious and political life. The longing for a court that cannot be bribed. But there is a danger here as well, and Enoch forces us to notice it. Apocalyptic certainty can comfort the wounded, but it can also tempt the self-righteous. Every generation is tempted to imagine itself among the pure witnesses and its enemies among the condemned. That is why a careful reading matters. The Book of Enoch is not an invitation to enjoy fantasies of destruction. Its judgment scenes are not entertainment. They are an accusation against corrupted power, including the kind of power that begins by believing it is above correction. The Watchers, after all, were not outsiders to heaven's order. They knew enough to be responsible. Their guilt is intensified by their rank. That detail makes the judgment more than revenge. It becomes a warning to every authority, celestial or earthly, that knowledge, status, and nearness to the sacred do not excuse betrayal. In fact, they make betrayal worse. This is where Enoch's ancient vision feels unexpectedly sharp. The book does not only condemn monsters, it condemns failed guardians. It condemns those who were entrusted with watching and instead consumed. those who were meant to preserve boundaries and instead violated them, those who had knowledge and used it to bend the world toward appetite. So when Enoch announces judgment, he is not simply predicting catastrophe. He is declaring that hierarchy itself will be judged. The higher powers are not immune. The heavenly rebel and the earthly tyrant both stand beneath a greater order. For an ancient audience, that was a profound reversal. For a modern audience, it remains one. We are used to seeing accountability flow downward. The weak are inspected. The poor are measured. The defeated are blamed. Enoch imagines accountability flowing upward into the places where power thought itself untouchable. That is why the text can feel dangerous, even now. Not because it gives us a secret map of heaven, but because it refuses to let authority hide behind mystery. The world of Enoch is full of visions, but its moral argument is plain. Nothing powerful is automatically righteous. And once that idea enters a tradition, it is difficult to contain. It can move quietly through sermons, legends, commentaries, and whispered speculation. It can attach itself to demons, angels, messianic hopes, and final reckonings. It can survive even when the book itself is pushed to the side. The Book of Enoch may have lived outside many canons, but its questions kept finding ways in. What happens to rebel angels? Who records the crimes of the powerful? When will the hidden court open? And who will stand as witness when it does? Those questions would not remain sealed in the ancient world. They would echo into early Christianity, where judgment, fallen powers, heavenly books, and the mysterious title, Son of Man, would take on new force. Not always directly from Enoch, not always in simple lines of influence, but close enough that the old text's shadow is difficult to ignore. Chapter 7. Echoes in Early Christianity. By the time early Christianity began to take shape, the world of Enoch had not disappeared. It was still there in the background, a charged atmosphere of fallen angels, final judgment, heavenly records, rebellious powers, and a human figure granted access to divine mysteries. Not every early Christian writer treated Enoch the same way. Not every community gave the book the same authority, but some of its ideas were already moving through the religious air. This is where the story becomes delicate. It is tempting to draw a straight line and say, Enoch caused this, Enoch caused that. Enoch secretly explains everything. That temptation should be resisted. Ancient religious ideas did not travel like modern footnotes, neatly labeled and filed. They moved through memory, teaching, shared imagery, sermons, interpretation, oral tradition, and texts copied in communities we can only partly reconstruct. Influence is real, but it is rarely tidy. What we can say with more confidence is that Enochic themes had strong points of contact with early Christian imagination. The idea of angels who sinned, the expectation of a final judgment, the presence of demons as part of a wounded spiritual order, the image of heavenly books where deeds are remembered, the hope that arrogant powers would be overturned. These were not minor decorative details. They helped shape how many ancient believers imagined the moral structure of the universe. One of the most important echoes is the figure called the Son of Man. In the Book of Enoch, especially in its visionary traditions, the Son of Man appears as an exalted figure associated with judgment, righteousness, and divine authority. In early Christianity, the title becomes deeply important in relation to Jesus. Scholars continue to discuss how direct the relationship is, And the evidence is not simple enough for slogans. But the overlap matters. It shows that early Christian language did not emerge in a vacuum. It grew in a world already alive with apocalyptic expectation. That world expected hidden things to be revealed. The Greek word behind apocalypse does not originally mean disaster in the way modern entertainment often uses it. It means unveiling, a pulling back of the covering, a disclosure of what was already true but not yet visible. Enoch belongs to that mental world. So did much early Christian preaching. The present age might look dominated by Rome, death, injustice, and spiritual hostility, but the veil would not stay closed forever. That is why Enoch's atmosphere could feel familiar to early Christians, even when the book's status remained uncertain. Some early writers knew it. Some respected it. Some quoted from it or treated it as valuable. The New Testament letter of Jude famously contains material associated with Enochic tradition, which helped preserve the sense that Enoch had not been entirely outside the early Christian conversation. But respect did not automatically mean canon. A text could be ancient, admired, and useful without becoming universally accepted as scripture. That distinction is crucial. Modern readers sometimes assume ancient believers divided books into only two categories: sacred truth or rejected falsehood. The reality was more textured. There were books read for instruction, books valued in certain regions, books considered edifying but not authoritative, books suspected of encouraging speculation, and books whose status shifted over time. Enoch lived in that complicated space, and it is not hard to see why. The book's angelology is rich, perhaps too rich for some later authorities. Its visions invite fascination. Its heavenly journeys offer maps of unseen realities. Its treatment of cosmic rebellion gives names and motives to beings who might otherwise remain vague. For a community trying to define doctrine, worship, and scriptural boundaries, such a text could be both useful and troublesome. Useful, because it gave language to evil. Troublesome, because it gave evil a dangerously elaborate mythology. There is a difference between saying that angels rebelled and building a vast imaginative world around how, why, and what they taught. Enoch does the second. It gives the reader details, scenes, categories, and cosmic mechanics. That can deepen faith, but it can also pull attention away from the central concerns of a community. The more vivid the unseen world becomes, the easier it is for speculation to become its own kind of devotion. This may help explain why Enoch's afterlife was so uneven. The book was not simply forgotten because no one cared. It was remembered by some, questioned by others, and gradually left outside the main scriptural collections of most Jewish and Christian traditions. Yet its themes remained strangely difficult to remove. Fallen angels did not vanish. Demons did not vanish. Judgment did not vanish. Heavenly books did not vanish. The architecture of the imagination remained, even when the old blueprint was no longer kept on the central table. That is one of the most interesting things about religious memory. A text can lose institutional status while its images survive inside the culture. People may stop reading the source while continuing to inherit its patterns. Enoch becomes like a buried root under later traditions, not always visible, not always the only source of nourishment, but still helping feed the growth above it. This also complicates the idea of suppression. Yes, the Book of Enoch was excluded from most canons. Yes, its status became contested. Yes, It survived fully in Ethiopia while disappearing from many other places. But the disappearance was not clean, and it was not total. Ideas are harder to exile than manuscripts. You can stop copying a book in one language or region, but if its imagery has already entered sermons, interpretations, and popular imagination, it continues traveling in disguise. For early Christians, Enoch's world offered a way to think about evil as more than bad behavior. Evil had depth. It had history. It had powers behind it. But Enoch also insisted that those powers had limits. They were not equal rivals to God. They were condemned rebels awaiting judgment. That balance mattered. Without it, fascination with fallen angels can become almost admiring. The rebel becomes glamorous. The forbidden becomes attractive simply because it is forbidden. But Enoch is much colder toward rebellion than many modern retellings. Its fallen beings are not romantic heroes. They are responsible agents whose knowledge magnifies their guilt. Early Christianity would carry forward that suspicion of rebellious power, while also developing its own center of gravity: Christ, resurrection, salvation, and the final defeat of evil. Enoch was not the center of that world, but it helped provide part of the older apocalyptic landscape in which that world made sense. And then, over time, the landscape changed. Communities became institutions, traditions became more defined, boundaries hardened. Questions that had once floated among visions and interpretations became matters of canon, doctrine, and authority. A book like Enoch, ancient, dramatic, morally serious, but filled with unruly heavenly material, became harder to place. It had echoed loudly enough to be remembered, but not safely enough to remain everywhere. Chapter 8. Why the Book Disappeared. The disappearance of the Book of Enoch was not a single event. There was no one night when officials gathered in a locked chamber, placed the book on a table, and decided that it must be erased from history. That version is dramatic, and drama has always been kind to conspiracy. But the real process was slower, less theatrical, and in some ways more revealing. Books disappear when communities stop copying them. That sounds almost too ordinary for a text as strange as Enoch, but it matters. In the ancient world, survival depended on labor. A manuscript did not reproduce itself. Someone had to believe it was worth the time, cost, training, and materials to copy it again, and again, and again. If a community no longer used a text in worship, teaching, or study, the text did not need to be publicly destroyed. It could simply age out of memory. This is one reason the story of Enoch should be handled carefully. Modern readers often speak as if exclusion from the Bible automatically proves suppression. Sometimes institutions do suppress texts. Sometimes power does fear writings that challenge it. But not every excluded book was hunted down. Not every lost text was buried by villains. Canon formation involved arguments about authority, tradition, theology, language, use, and communal identity. It was not always noble, and it was not always simple. But it was rarely as clean as the phrase, "they removed it," suggests. The Book of Enoch made those questions especially difficult. It had antiquity. It had influence. It had visionary force. It was associated with a biblical figure who had never died in the ordinary way, a figure whose mystery almost invited expansion. It also contained material that could make religious authorities uneasy. Named angels, cosmic geography, forbidden teachings, heavenly journeys, and a detailed account of angelic rebellion. For some readers, that made it profound. For others, it made it dangerous. The problem was not merely that Enoch described fallen angels. Traditions could accommodate the idea that angels sinned. The harder issue was how much attention the book gave them. The Watchers are not mentioned briefly and then dismissed. Their story becomes a framework for explaining corruption, violence, forbidden arts, and judgment. Once a reader enters that world, the imagination has many paths to wander, and wandering imagination is difficult to govern. A community trying to define its central scriptures may hesitate before a text that invites intense speculation about heavenly beings. Angelic hierarchies can easily become a fascination of their own. Cosmic secrets can become spiritual currency. The hidden can begin to feel more exciting than the ethical. And when that happens, a book meant to warn against corrupted knowledge can become, ironically, an object of appetite. That irony may have followed Enoch for centuries. The book condemns the misuse of secret knowledge, yet it became attractive partly because it seemed to contain secrets. It warns against beings who cross boundaries, yet its readers are often drawn by the feeling that they themselves are crossing a boundary when they open it. This does not make the book false or harmful. It simply means that its power is unstable. It can deepen moral imagination, or it can feed the thrill of forbidden access. Religious institutions tend to distrust unstable power. There were also theological tensions. Enoch's elaborate story of the Watchers could sit awkwardly beside other explanations of sin, evil, and human responsibility. If too much blame falls on fallen angels teaching corrupted arts, then what happens to the moral agency of human beings? If demons, giants, and heavenly rebellions become too vivid, does the spiritual drama become crowded with secondary figures? These were not necessarily formal objections written neatly in one place. They were pressures that made the book harder to domesticate. And canon, whatever else it is also a form of domestication. A canon creates a boundary around authoritative memory. It says, these are the texts by which a community will measure itself. That boundary gives identity and continuity, but it also leaves some powerful writings outside. Enoch remained close enough to the boundary to be remembered, but too unruly to be welcomed everywhere inside. Its language history also mattered. As traditions shifted, as Greek, Aramaic, Hebrew, Latin, Syriac, Coptic, and Ge'ez worlds preserved different bodies of literature in different ways, the survival of any text depended on networks. If the right communities did not copy it in the right languages at the right time, disappearance could happen without a conspiracy. A book could be famous in fragments and still vanish in full. That is almost what happened to Enoch. In many regions, it became a text known through echoes, quotations, references, and partial memory. The book's reputation survived better than the book itself. People could inherit ideas about fallen angels or heavenly judgment without holding the complete work in their hands. Enoch became less a living manuscript tradition and more a ghost behind other traditions. But ghosts can be powerful. A missing book often grows larger in the imagination than a present one. When a text is available, it can be read, criticized, compared, and placed back into proportion. When it is absent, it becomes a screen for desire. People project onto it the things they believe official history has hidden. It becomes not just a book, but an accusation. That is why the disappearance of Enoch later became part of its magnetism. The less accessible it was, the more it seemed to matter. Its absence invited questions. Why was it left out? Who decided? What did it say that made it uncomfortable? Were its visions too strange, too Jewish, too apocalyptic, too angelic, too difficult? Or was its marginalization simply the result of historical processes that were messy, uneven, and not always guided by a single motive? The honest answer is not one answer. The Book of Enoch disappeared from most traditions because several forces converged: canon formation, theological caution, linguistic transmission, changing patterns of use, and discomfort with speculative angelology. None of these explanations is as thrilling as a secret ban. Together, they are more plausible, and perhaps more interesting, because they show how fragile survival really is. A text does not need to be hated in order to disappear. It only needs to become inconvenient, contested, untranslated, uncopied, or unnecessary to the institutions that control memory. That is a quieter form of loss, but not a gentler one. Still, the Book of Enoch did not vanish completely. At the edges of the wider Christian world, in a tradition that many Western readers would later overlook, the book remained alive. Not as rumor, not as a fragment, not as a forbidden title whispered by seekers of secret wisdom, as scripture. And this is where the story moves away from the fantasy of suppression and toward a more remarkable truth. The full text survived because one ancient Christian tradition kept reading it when much of the rest of the world had stopped. Chapter 9. The Ethiopian Preservation. The survival of the Book of Enoch does not lead us into a hidden vault beneath a ruined castle. It leads us to Ethiopia. That may seem, at first, like a quieter turn in the story. After angels, giants, judgment, and forbidden teachings, preservation can sound almost administrative. A matter of manuscripts, languages, libraries, and church tradition. But in the history of ancient texts, preservation is never merely administrative. It is the difference between a voice and an absence. For much of the wider Jewish and Christian world, Enoch became partial, distant, or missing. Known in fragments, remembered in echoes, discussed through traces. But in the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition, the book remained part of the biblical world in a far stronger and more living sense. It was not merely an exotic curiosity waiting for European scholars to rediscover it. It belonged to a tradition that had kept it. That distinction matters. Too often, the story is told as if the book was lost until the West found it again. But lost to whom? Not to everyone. The language of rediscovery can quietly place Europe at the center of a history it did not preserve. The fuller truth is more humbling. While many traditions let Enoch fade, Ethiopia carried it forward. This does not require a conspiracy to be extraordinary. In fact, the non-conspiracy is more interesting. A book survives because a community gives it a home. It is copied, read, translated, remembered, and treated as meaningful across generations. Not because every reader fully understands every ancient layer within it, and not because the manuscript tradition remains untouched by time, but because the text continues to belong somewhere. That is one of the great lessons of Enoch's survival. Texts do not float above history. They need bodies, voices, scribes, liturgies, teachers, arguments, shelves, climates, political conditions, and stubborn continuity. A book can have all the mystery in the world, but if no one copies it, mystery turns to silence. Ethiopia prevented that silence. The Book of Enoch survived there in Ge'ez, the ancient liturgical language of the Ethiopian Church. Through that preservation, a work that had largely disappeared in full from many other traditions remained accessible in a form substantial enough to change modern understanding of ancient apocalyptic literature. The fact may sound simple, its consequences are enormous, because without the Ethiopian preservation, Enoch might be known mostly as a shadow. Scholars might still discuss quotations. The curious might still chase references. Theologians might still speculate about its relationship to early Christianity. But the full force of the book, its strange architecture, its moral imagination, its sequences of visions and judgments, would be far harder to reconstruct. We would be describing a vanished landscape from a few stones at its edge. Instead, Ethiopia kept the landscape open. This also changes how we should think about authority and margins. From one angle, Enoch survived at the margins of the traditions most familiar to Western readers. But from another angle, that phrasing is misleading. Ethiopia was not a margin to itself. It was a center of its own Christian world, with its own memory, canon, language, and sacred history. What appears peripheral depends heavily on where the map is drawn, and maps are rarely innocent. When later European readers encountered the Ethiopian Enoch, they often approached it with a sense of surprise, even suspicion. How could a book missing from so much of the biblical world be alive here? But that question reveals an assumption, that the main story must be the one preserved in Europe and the Mediterranean West. Enoch resists that assumption simply by existing. Its survival says that religious history is not a single river. It is a braided system of channels. Some run dry, some disappear underground, some continue far from the places later historians choose to emphasize. And sometimes the text thought to be lost has not been hiding at all. It has simply been preserved by people the dominant story failed to notice. There is also something fitting about Ethiopia's role in this particular story. The Book of Enoch is a text about witness, and its own survival depended on witness. It is a text about records, and it lived because records were made. It is a text about judgment against arrogant powers, and its preservation quietly judges the arrogance of any history that assumes important memory belongs only to the most politically dominant centers. This does not mean the Ethiopian tradition kept Enoch in some untouched, pristine chamber outside history. No manuscript tradition is that simple. Texts move, change, are copied by human hands, and carry the marks of transmission. But preservation does not have to mean perfect stillness. Sometimes preservation means a living relationship strong enough to carry a book across centuries. That is what happened here. And once Western scholars and travelers became aware that Ethiopia possessed the full text, the story changed again. A book that had lived within one tradition began to re-enter another world, not as a rumor, but as a manuscript object that could be translated, printed, debated, and absorbed into modern scholarship. The return would create its own misunderstandings. Some readers saw in Enoch a key to early Judaism and Christianity. Others saw a forbidden scripture unjustly excluded. Still others folded it into esoteric theories, secret histories, and eventually the growing mythology of orders like the Knights Templar. Once a text leaves the community that preserved it and enters the marketplace of modern fascination, it becomes vulnerable to new kinds of distortion. But before those distortions, there is a simpler scene worth holding in mind. Not a dramatic council suppressing a dangerous book. Not knights hiding a manuscript beneath a temple. Not a secret society guarding angelic names. Instead, a tradition continuing to read what others had stopped copying, a book surviving because it remained useful, sacred, and alive to the people who kept it. That is less sensational than legend. It is also the reason the legend could exist at all, because when the Book of Enoch returned to European awareness, it did not return as an empty title. It returned with substance, pages, visions, names, judgments, a world. And once that world became readable again, it began to attract every kind of seeker: scholars, theologians, mystics, skeptics, and those who suspected that history's official shelves were missing something important. The text had survived. Now it was about to be reinterpreted. Chapter 10. The Lost Book returns to Europe. When the Book of Enoch returned to European awareness, it did not arrive like a thunderclap. It arrived as manuscripts do, carried by travelers, handled by scholars, translated slowly, argued over in rooms where excitement often had to disguise itself as patience. There is a particular drama in that kind of return, but it is not the drama of swords or secret rites. It is the drama of recognition. A book long known in fragments was suddenly no longer only a rumor. For European readers, this was disorienting. Enoch had hovered at the edge of memory for centuries. It appeared in references, in ancient quotations, in theological questions that had never fully gone away. People knew enough to suspect that something important had been missing, but not enough to stand inside the text itself. Then Ethiopian manuscripts made fuller access possible, and the old shadow became a body. This is one of those moments when scholarship and imagination begin walking too close together. For scholars, the return of Enoch opened a serious window into ancient Judaism, apocalyptic thought, early Christian backgrounds, and the development of ideas about angels, demons, judgment, and heavenly revelation. It was not merely a curiosity. It helped illuminate the religious world out of which later traditions emerged. But for others, the return meant something more emotionally charged. A lost book had come back. That phrase has power. It suggests interruption, concealment, a broken chain suddenly repaired. Even when the historical reality is more complicated, not lost everywhere, not hidden in the way legend imagines, not newly discovered by those who had always preserved it, the emotional force remains. A book absent from familiar Bibles had returned with angels, forbidden knowledge, cosmic judgment, and a voice attributed to the man who walked with God and vanished. It was almost impossible for such a text not to attract speculation. The modern Western imagination has a particular weakness for missing books. We are drawn to the idea that somewhere outside approved shelves lies the missing explanation, the document that would change doctrine, expose power, repair history, or reveal what authorities did not want known. Sometimes that instinct leads to real discoveries. Archives do contain surprises. Traditions do suppress inconvenient voices. But the instinct can also become a machine that turns every gap in history into evidence of a plot. Enoch entered that machine very easily. Its contents were already charged with secrecy, heavenly tablets, angelic teachings, hidden sins, judgments pronounced beyond the reach of earthly courts. Even its absence from many canons seemed to confirm, for some readers, that the book had been too dangerous to survive openly. The fact that it had survived in Ethiopia was transformed, in some retellings, from a history of preservation into a clue in a larger mystery. That shift is subtle but important. Preservation becomes suppression. Transmission becomes concealment. Canon formation becomes cover-up. And a difficult ancient text becomes a forbidden manual. This is not to say that institutions never manage memory. Of course they do. Religious history is filled with decisions about which books matter, which voices are trusted, which interpretations are dangerous, and which teachings are allowed to shape communities. But Enoch's return shows how easily a real historical marginalization can be inflated into something more theatrical than the evidence supports. The book did not need exaggeration. Its actual story was already remarkable. Here was a text that had influenced religious imagination, faded from many traditions, survived in one major Christian tradition, and returned at a time when Europe was increasingly hungry for origins. Scholars were studying ancient languages, comparing manuscripts, rethinking biblical backgrounds, and asking how Judaism and Christianity had developed across centuries. At the same time, esoteric movements, antiquarians, secret society enthusiasts, and spiritual seekers were looking for hidden continuities beneath official religion. Enoch could speak to both rooms. In the scholar's room, it was evidence, a witness to an ancient apocalyptic worldview, a complicated text requiring philology, comparison, and caution. In the seeker's room, it was a key, a sign that the visible canon was incomplete, a relic of wisdom from before the boundary was drawn, a book that seemed to confirm that heaven once taught secrets and that someone, somewhere, might still know where the rest were kept. The same text could produce two very different hungers. That is part of the reason Enoch's modern afterlife became so crowded. It was pulled into debates about early Christianity, biblical interpretation, angelology, demonology, mysticism, occult tradition, and alternative history. Each group found a different Enoch. Some found a historical source. Some found a spiritual warning. Some found a suppressed scripture. Some found proof of theories the text itself never intended to support. The book became a mirror again. Readers saw not only what was written there, but what they wanted absence to mean. The missing centuries became almost as important as the surviving words. Enoch's authority, for many modern minds, came from a strange combination. It felt ancient enough to matter, excluded enough to be suspicious, and visionary enough to seem dangerous. That combination is intoxicating. But intoxication is exactly what a careful reading of Enoch warns against. The book is not impressed by secret knowledge simply because it is secret. It is deeply concerned with the moral condition of the one who receives knowledge. That is the irony running through its modern rediscovery. Many people came to Enoch looking for forbidden wisdom, while the text itself was asking whether forbidden wisdom had already helped ruin the world. Still, the return to Europe changed the book's fate permanently. Once translated and discussed, it could no longer remain only an Ethiopian scriptural treasure or a scholarly puzzle. It entered the broader imagination. It became part of the library of the mysterious. And from there, it was only a matter of time before it was drawn toward one of the most magnetic legends in Western secret history: the Knights Templar. The connection is not simple. It is not proven in the way popular stories often imply. There is no solid evidence that the Templars guarded the Book of Enoch as a central secret of their order. But legends do not require solid evidence to grow. They require atmosphere, gaps, dramatic timing, and symbols that fit too well together to be ignored. Enoch had all of those. The Templars had them too. And when a book of fallen angels, forbidden knowledge, and heavenly records meets an order remembered for secrecy, wealth, crusade, accusation, and destruction, the historical facts begin to cast a very long imaginative shadow. Chapter 11. The Templars and the Hunger for Hidden Wisdom. The Knights Templar enter this story carrying far more legend than any historical order can comfortably bear. That is part of the problem. They were real men, in a real institution, shaped by the hard politics of crusade, pilgrimage, land, money, vows, warfare, and devotion. But the Templars most people imagine today often belong to a different world. Vaults beneath Jerusalem, secret relics, hidden scriptures, coded rituals, forbidden doctrines, and treasures spirited away just before the fall. The historical Templars were already remarkable without any of that. They began as a military religious order, formed to protect Christian pilgrims in the Holy Land. Over time, they became powerful, wealthy, and widely connected, with holdings across Europe and a presence in the Crusader East. They were monks, but armed, religious, but military, pious in their official identity, but deeply entangled with finance and politics. In other words, they were almost designed to become mysterious in the eyes of later generations. Not because they were necessarily hiding ancient books, because they occupied a category people found difficult to understand. A monk with a sword is already a contradiction. A religious order with wealth invites suspicion. A disciplined brotherhood with initiation rites, internal hierarchy, and international reach offers imagination plenty of room to wander. Add the Holy Land, a place dense with biblical memory and contested sacred geography, and the Templars become a perfect vessel for stories about secrets. This does not mean the stories are true. It means they were easy to build. The Templars lived in proximity to traditions far older and more varied than the Latin Christian world they came from. In the Eastern Mediterranean, they encountered Eastern Christians, Muslims, Jews, local customs, languages, legends, architecture, and sacred sites layered over one another by centuries of devotion and conflict. It is reasonable to imagine that they heard stories unfamiliar to Western Europe. It is reasonable to imagine that some members encountered texts, rumors, or interpretations outside the standard religious education of a Latin knight. But reasonable possibility is not proof. This is where the line must be drawn carefully. The Templars could have encountered unusual traditions. That does not mean they possessed the Book of Enoch. They may have heard legends about ancient patriarchs, fallen angels, or hidden wisdom. That does not mean they guarded a secret Enochic archive. The atmosphere is suggestive. The evidence is thin. And yet, legends rarely grow from evidence alone. They grow from mood, contradiction, and unresolved endings. The Templars had all three. Their wealth made people suspicious. Their secrecy made people curious. Their military failures in the Holy Land made their power seem vulnerable. Their sudden arrest and destruction in the early 14th century turned suspicion into mythology. Once an order is accused of heresy, dismantled under political pressure, and remembered through confessions extracted in conditions that make certainty difficult, later imagination rushes in to fill the cracks. The result is a strange transformation. The Templar becomes less a medieval knight and more a symbolic guardian. Guardian of what? That depends on the storyteller. The Holy Grail, the Ark of the Covenant, the bloodline of Christ, Islamic wisdom, Gnostic teachings, temple treasure, lost scriptures, maps, codes, relics, anything powerful enough to explain why the order had to be destroyed. The Book of Enoch fits easily into that symbolic shelf. It is ancient. It is biblical adjacent. It contains forbidden knowledge. It survived outside most familiar canons. It speaks of angels who sinned, secrets that corrupted the world, and judgment against powers that thought themselves untouchable. For someone already inclined to believe the Templars protected hidden truths, Enoch feels like the kind of book they would have wanted. But that feeling is not evidence. A careful investigation has to let the romance breathe without letting it take control. It has to admit why the connection is attractive, while also refusing to present attraction as fact. There is no need to flatten the mystery, but there is also no need to counterfeit certainty. The Templars became attached to hidden wisdom, partly because their real history left behind so many sealed doors. Medieval religious orders did have internal rules. Initiations did happen behind closed walls. Military strategy was not public theater. Financial networks could look almost magical to outsiders. And after the order's fall, hostile accusations made those closed doors seem darker than they may have been. This is how secrecy changes after a catastrophe. Before destruction, secrecy can mean discipline, privacy, or institutional structure. After destruction, the same secrecy begins to look like concealment. Every missing document becomes meaningful. Every ritual becomes suspect. Every silence becomes an invitation. The Book of Enoch underwent a similar transformation in the modern imagination. Its absence from many biblical canons made it seem not only excluded, but dangerous. Its survival in Ethiopia made it feel like a recovered fragment of a hidden world. Its angelic content made it irresistible to readers looking for cosmic secrets. So when Enoch and the Templars are brought together, they reinforce each other's aura. The book seems like something a secret order would guard. The order seems like the kind of institution that would guard such a book. That circular logic is powerful, but it remains circular. Still, even legends can reveal something true about human hunger. The Templar-Enoch connection may tell us less about medieval archives and more about modern desire. We want to believe that someone protected the difficult books. We want to believe that lost wisdom did not simply fall through the accidents of language, copying, and canon. We want guardians. We want continuity. We want a hidden hand carrying meaning across the centuries. The historical world is often less elegant. Books survive because communities copy them. Orders fall because kings need money. Popes face pressure. Politics tighten, and reputations become useful weapons. Legends grow because uncertainty is intolerable, and mystery feels better when it has custodians. The Templars became those custodians in the imagination, and once that happened, almost any text with the right atmosphere could be placed in their hands. Enoch, with its forbidden teachings and judgment against corrupted powers, was especially easy to place there. It did not matter that the bridge was mostly symbolic. Symbolic bridges are often stronger in popular memory than documented roads. So we approach the Templars not as confirmed guardians of Enoch, but as a mirror held up to Enoch's modern afterlife. They show what happens when a real historical order becomes a container for every secret people wish had survived. They show how the hunger for hidden wisdom can turn uncertainty into architecture, and they prepare us for the next, more careful question. Not what the Templars definitely protected, but what they could realistically have encountered in the crowded, multilingual, religiously tangled world of the Crusades. Chapter 12. What the Templars Could Have Known. The most honest word in the Templar part of this story is not secret. It is contact. The Knights Templar lived and fought in a world where cultures met each other under pressure. The Crusader East was not a clean border between one civilization and another. It was a crowded zone of languages, loyalties, rivalries, trade, diplomacy, pilgrimage, warfare, translation, and daily negotiation. Latin Christians moved through places where Eastern Christians, Muslims, Jews, Armenians, Syrians, Greeks, Arabs, and many others carried their own memories of scripture and sacred history. A Templar, in that world, did not need to be a mystic to encounter unfamiliar ideas. He only needed to be present. That presence is where the real investigation begins. The order had reason to interact with local populations, rulers, guides, merchants, clergy, and other military groups. They occupied fortresses, guarded roads, managed resources, and operated in territories layered with religious meaning. Jerusalem itself was not merely a city to them. It was the imagined center of biblical history, a place where every stone seemed capable of attracting a legend. So what could they have known? They could have heard stories that did not circulate widely in the same form back in Western Europe. They could have encountered Eastern Christian traditions with different emphases, local legends about holy sites, Jewish interpretations attached to ancient figures, and Islamic accounts of prophets, angels, judgment, and hidden wisdom. They could have come across rumors of books, relics, or teachings that sounded strange to Latin ears. That is historically plausible. But plausibility is not possession. There is a difference between a Templar hearing a story about ancient patriarchs and the Templar order guarding a manuscript of Enoch. There is a difference between cultural contact and doctrinal adoption. There is a difference between an individual knight's curiosity and an institutional secret. Popular legend often collapses these distances because the collapsed version is more exciting. A careful storyteller has to put the distances back. The Book of Enoch complicates the question further. By the time of the Crusades, the full text of Enoch was not widely circulating in the Latin West. Its strongest survival was in the Ethiopian tradition. And while the medieval Eastern Mediterranean was connected in many ways, there is no solid evidence that the Templars obtained, studied, or protected the Book of Enoch as a formal treasure. The evidence simply does not allow that claim. What we can say is narrower, but still interesting. The kinds of ideas Enoch contains: fallen angels, heavenly secrets, judgment, corrupted knowledge, ancient patriarchs granted divine insight, belong to a broader world of religious imagination. Some of those themes existed in multiple traditions. A Templar did not need a copy of Enoch to hear stories about angelic rebellion or hidden wisdom. The ancient Near East and Mediterranean were full of overlapping memories, commentaries, legends, and theological disputes. This is where the boundary between influence and resemblance becomes difficult. Two traditions can share imagery without one directly borrowing from the other. A story can echo because it comes from a common scriptural environment, not because someone passed along a particular manuscript. Later writers often see resemblance and immediately imagine a secret chain of transmission. Sometimes such chains exist. Often, the resemblance is more diffuse. The Templar legend thrives in that diffusion. The order's presence in the Holy Land gives it just enough historical grounding to seem possible. Their later reputation for secrecy gives the possibility emotional force. The missing evidence then becomes, for believers in the legend, not a problem, but part of the proof. Of course, there is no evidence, the argument goes. They were secret. That is a seductive move, but a dangerous one. When absence becomes proof, investigation has ended. Anything can be made true by claiming the evidence was hidden perfectly. This is how secret histories lose contact with history and become self-protecting myths. The more carefully you question them, the more they accuse caution of being part of the cover-up. A better approach is to ask what kind of knowledge realistically traveled. Texts traveled, yes, but not effortlessly. Manuscripts were expensive, language-bound, fragile, and dependent on scribes. Ideas traveled more easily. A story could cross a marketplace faster than a book could cross a monastery. A motif could be retold, reshaped, misunderstood, and absorbed. A rumor of ancient wisdom could travel without the ancient text itself. So perhaps the most plausible Templar encounter was not with Enoch as a book, but with an Enochic atmosphere. A world where sacred history felt layered, where angels and prophets belonged to shared imagination, where hidden knowledge was both feared and desired, where the line between scripture, legend, commentary, and local tradition was not always obvious to outsiders. That does not prove a secret archive. It does explain why later people imagined one. The Templars stood at the crossroads of the medieval sacred imagination. They were Western monks in Eastern landscapes, soldiers in holy places, poor knights who became rich, defenders of pilgrimage who became entangled with power. They were not outside history. They were caught in too much of it. That made them ideal candidates for later stories about dangerous knowledge crossing from east to west. And there is a human reason this idea persists. We dislike accidental loss. We dislike the thought that ancient books disappeared because no one copied them, or because language networks shifted, or because communities changed their reading habits. Those explanations feel too fragile. So we invent guardians. Someone must have known. Someone must have saved the truth. Someone must have carried the forbidden text through the smoke of history. The Templars are asked to play that role again and again. But the real medieval world was not a clean trail of clues. It was a field of partial contact. People heard things imperfectly. They misunderstood each other. They borrowed without admitting it. They condemned what they half understood. They preserved some things and forgot others. A Templar might encounter an unfamiliar tradition and see not hidden wisdom, but heresy, confusion, or local superstition. We should not assume curiosity where fear may have been stronger. That is the uncomfortable correction. Modern seekers often imagine the Templars as unusually open-minded collectors of wisdom. Some individuals may have been curious, practical, adaptable, even intellectually flexible, but they were also members of a Latin Christian military order, bound by vows and shaped by the conflicts of their age. Contact with other traditions did not automatically produce appreciation. Sometimes it produced suspicion. So the evidence leaves us with a careful conclusion. The Templars could have encountered stories, motifs, and religious ideas that overlapped with the world of Enoch. They could have heard legends about ancient figures, angels, forbidden knowledge, and divine judgment. They lived in a place where such material had many possible channels, but there is no firm basis for claiming they possessed the Book of Enoch. And yet, that uncertainty did not weaken the legend. It strengthened it, because the Templars were about to suffer the kind of public destruction that turns ordinary secrecy into permanent suspicion. Once the order fell, Every unanswered question around them became darker. Every closed ritual became evidence. Every rumor found a new home. The trial did not merely end the Templars. It created the conditions for the myth that would outlive them. Chapter 13. The Trial and the Birth of the Myth. The Templar legend was born in the wreckage of the order itself, not at its founding, not in the first years of guarding pilgrims, not even in the long years when the order gained land, wealth, and influence across Europe. The legend became truly dangerous when the Templars were destroyed. In the early 14th century, the order was arrested, interrogated, accused, and dismantled under a cloud of charges that seemed designed to poison memory. Heresy, blasphemy, secret rites, obscene initiation practices, denial of sacred beliefs, strange worship. The accusations were shocking, and that was part of their power. They did not merely attack individual men. They turned the order's secrecy into evidence against it. This is the moment where history becomes hard to hold steady. The trials produced confessions, but many were extracted under pressure, fear, and torture. Some were later withdrawn. Political motives were deeply entangled with religious language. The French crown had strong reasons to want the Templars broken. Their wealth, their independence, their debts and financial power, their symbolic usefulness as a target. The papacy, under immense pressure, moved through a situation where justice, politics, and survival were not easily separated. So what do the trial records prove? Less than the legend wants. They prove that accusations were made. They prove that some Templars confessed to disturbing things under conditions that make certainty difficult. They prove that the order's closed rituals could be reinterpreted in the darkest possible way once hostile power turned against it. But they do not cleanly prove the existence of a hidden religion, a secret archive, or a protected, forbidden scripture. And yet, the damage was done. Once an institution is publicly accused of secret heresy, it becomes almost impossible for later imagination to leave it alone. The accusation creates a shape, even where evidence is weak. It gives rumor a skeleton. It tells future storytellers where to hang the symbols: a hidden idol, a denied Christ, a midnight ceremony, an oath, a treasure, a book. This is how mythology often grows. Not from proof, but from accusation plus silence. The Templars were secretive in the ordinary ways. Many medieval, religious, and military institutions were secretive. They had internal rules. They had ceremonies outsiders did not fully witness. They handled money, letters, military planning, and property. Much of that secrecy was practical. But after the arrests, practical secrecy began to look sinister. Closed doors became ritual chambers. Discipline became conspiracy. Absence of evidence became the sign of a cover-up. The trial changed the meaning of everything that came before it. Even the Templars' presence in the Holy Land was reinterpreted. Had they discovered something beneath the Temple Mount? Had they learned forbidden doctrines from Eastern sects? Had they recovered lost books? Had they found proof dangerous to the Church or the Crown? These questions are later growths, not solid conclusions from the evidence. But they grew because the fall of the order created a vacuum, and vacuums invite stories. The more abruptly a powerful institution collapses, the harder people search for a hidden cause. Ordinary explanations feel insufficient. Debt, politics, royal ambition, ecclesiastical pressure, legal procedure, these are real, but they do not satisfy the imagination the way a forbidden secret does. We prefer a buried object to an accounting ledger. We prefer a dangerous manuscript to a financial crisis. That preference tells us something about ourselves. The Templar myth survives because it makes history feel morally legible. If the order was destroyed because it guarded a secret, then its fall becomes meaningful in a dramatic way. The Templars become martyrs of hidden truth, or villains of hidden corruption, depending on the storyteller. Either version is more emotionally satisfying than the messy possibility that they were destroyed by a convergence of power, money, fear, politics, and institutional vulnerability. But messy history is often where the truth lives. This does not mean the accusations were meaningless. They mattered enormously. They shaped the destruction of the order and the centuries of legend that followed. They show how dangerous secrecy becomes when an institution loses protection. They show how confession can be made unreliable by coercion. They show how political power can use religious fear to turn public opinion. Most of all, they show how a myth can begin before anyone realizes it is a myth. During the trials, the accusations were part of a legal and political campaign. Later, they became raw material for esoteric history. Every strange claim could be detached from its courtroom setting and retold as a clue. A confession extracted in terror could become evidence of secret initiation. A rumor could become a tradition. A hostile charge could become, centuries later, a badge of hidden wisdom. This is where the Book of Enoch begins to fit the Templar legend, not through documentation, but through symbolic gravity. Enoch is a book about forbidden teaching and judgment against corrupted powers. The Templar trial is a story about an order accused of hidden rites and destroyed by powers many later readers viewed as corrupt. Put those two stories near each other, and they begin to resonate. The fallen watchers taught dangerous secrets. The Templars were accused of keeping dangerous secrets. Enoch says judgment reaches the highest authorities. The Templar myth asks whether earthly authorities condemned what they feared. The connection is not evidence, it is alignment. And alignment can be powerful enough to create belief. By the time later generations looked back, the Templars no longer belonged only to medieval history. They had become a screen for suspicion toward institutions, churches, kings, and official narratives. Whatever people believed had been hidden, the Templars could be imagined as its guardians. Whatever people believed had been unjustly destroyed, the Templars could be imagined as its victims. In that sense, the trial did not simply end a medieval order. It opened a symbolic archive. Into that archive, later storytellers placed relics, codes, bloodlines, heresies, treasures, and books that no record securely places in Templar hands. The Book of Enoch would eventually become one of those imagined possibilities, not because the historical bridge is strong, but because the themes fit with uncanny ease. A forbidden book, a fallen order, a world suspicious of official memory, a hunger to believe that somewhere, someone protected what power tried to bury. That hunger did not end with the trials, it expanded. And once Enoch and the Templars met inside that hunger, the legend became less about what happened in medieval archives and more about what forbidden knowledge means to people who no longer trust the guardians of history. Chapter 14, Enoch and the Templar Legend. The Book of Enoch and the Knights Templar do not meet on solid historical ground. That has to be said plainly. There is no reliable evidence that the Templars preserved the Book of Enoch as a secret scripture. No confirmed Templar archive has produced it, No dependable medieval record shows the order guarding Enochic manuscripts as part of its hidden inheritance. The bridge between them is not made of documents. It is made of resonance, and resonance, while not proof, can be powerful. The Book of Enoch tells of beings entrusted with watching the world who betray that trust. It speaks of forbidden knowledge crossing a boundary, entering human life, and changing civilization for the worse. It imagines heavenly records, final judgment, and a moral order that will eventually expose powers that seemed untouchable. The Templar legend, in its later form, circles many of the same themes: an order placed in the Holy Land, a brotherhood surrounded by secrecy, accusations of forbidden rites, rumors of hidden knowledge, a dramatic fall under the pressure of kings and religious authority, a long afterlife in which people wonder whether the official story was ever complete. It is easy to see why the two became attractive to the same imagination. Enoch gives the legend cosmic depth. The Templars give Enoch a medieval hiding place. Together, they create the feeling of a secret continuity running beneath official history. Ancient revelation, guarded wisdom, institutional fear, and a book too dangerous to remain in the open. But feelings are not archives. The evidence remains stubborn. Enoch survived because it was preserved in the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition, not because we can prove a military order carried it through hidden corridors of Europe. The Templars became legendary because their destruction was politically charged, legally troubling, and symbolically dramatic, not because we can demonstrate they possessed the lost library of heaven. Still, it would be too easy to dismiss the connection as merely foolish. Legends often survive because they express a truth indirectly, even when they fail as literal history. The Templar-Enoch Association reveals a deep human pattern. We attach forbidden books to forbidden institutions. We imagine that dangerous knowledge must have guardians, because it is difficult to accept that survival may depend on something as fragile as copying, translation, and community memory. A manuscript tradition feels too ordinary. A secret order feels worthy of the mystery. That is why Enoch fits so easily into Templar mythology. The book itself carries the atmosphere of a sealed record. It presents knowledge as both revelation and danger. It speaks from the border between heaven and earth, where ordinary categories fail. A reader already fascinated by hidden orders can hardly resist imagining such a text in the hands of men who lived near the ruins of biblical history and were later accused of secret crimes. The match is narratively perfect. Historically, that is exactly the problem. Perfect matches should make us cautious. History is rarely shaped like a well-written novel. It is uneven, repetitive, bureaucratic, and full of accidents. Legends, by contrast, are excellent editors. They remove inconvenience. They tighten symbolism. They turn coincidence into design. They make every object belong exactly where imagination wants it. The Book of Enoch becomes the forbidden text. The Templars become the forbidden guardians. The church and crown become the frightened powers. The trial becomes the attempted erasure. It is a compelling structure, but it is not the same as evidence. The more interesting question is why that structure feels necessary. Perhaps it is because Enoch and the Templars both unsettle trust in official boundaries. Enoch asks why some texts stand outside the Bible while still sounding ancient, sacred, and urgent. The Templars ask why a celebrated Christian order could be destroyed so violently and remembered through accusations that are difficult to untangle. Both stories involve institutions deciding what belongs inside and what must be cast out. A book outside the canon, an order outside protection, a memory outside control. That shared condition gives the legend its emotional logic. It also explains why modern readers often approach both with suspicion already in place. They do not come asking only, "What happened?" They come asking, "What was hidden from us?" That question can be useful when it challenges lazy official narratives, but it can also become a trap. If every absence is treated as proof of concealment, then history becomes impossible to correct. It can only be accused. The Book of Enoch deserves better than that. So do the Templars. Enoch is not fascinating because someone definitely locked it away in a medieval vault. It is fascinating because it survived unevenly, because its ideas entered and exited traditions in complex ways, because it shows how ancient people imagined evil, power, and judgment. The Templars are not fascinating because they certainly possessed every relic later writers handed them. They are fascinating because their real history, piety, violence, money, loyalty, politics, and collapse, is already filled with tension. When we force them together too tightly, we flatten both. But when we hold them side by side carefully, something valuable appears. We see how forbidden knowledge becomes a story people use to think about authority. Enoch warns that knowledge without moral order can corrupt the world. Templar legend asks whether authority itself may become corrupt when it claims the right to define truth and destroy those who threaten its control. The two stories are not the same, but they speak to each other across a symbolic distance. One fears the misuse of hidden knowledge. The other fears the suppression of hidden knowledge. Between those fears lies the modern obsession with secret history. That obsession is not always irrational. Official histories have often excluded voices, destroyed records, and protected power. But suspicion alone is not wisdom. A hidden text is not automatically true. An accused order is not automatically innocent. A dramatic connection is not automatically historical. Enoch teaches that the desire for forbidden things can itself become dangerous. That may be the most useful warning it brings into the Templar legend, because the question is not only whether the Templars protected the Book of Enoch. The stronger question is why we want them to have protected it. What emptiness does that idea fill? What distrust does it satisfy? What kind of world do we imagine when we picture ancient wisdom passing secretly from angelic visions to crusader knights to modern seekers? Maybe we imagine a world where truth cannot be fully killed. Maybe we imagine that someone somewhere carried the record through the fire. And even if the Templar connection remains unproven, the longing behind it tells us why the Book of Enoch never became just another ancient text. It became a mirror for everyone who suspects that the official shelf is missing something, and that the missing thing might change the way we understand the whole room. Chapter 15, The Forbidden Text as Mirror. A forbidden book is never just a book. It becomes a test of trust. The Book of Enoch has attracted readers for centuries not only because of what it contains, but because of where it stands. Outside most familiar biblical canons, preserved in a tradition many outsiders once misunderstood or ignored, filled with angels, judgment, heavenly journeys, and knowledge that feels both sacred and dangerous. It occupies the perfect position for suspicion, close enough to the Bible to feel authoritative, far enough outside it to feel withheld. That position gives it power. Many people first come to Enoch with a question that is not really about ancient literature. They ask, Why was this removed? Or, what did someone not want us to know? Those questions are understandable. Institutions do shape memory. Religious authorities have made decisions about which texts are read, copied, translated, and trusted. History is not innocent. But suspicion can become its own kind of blindness. If we assume every excluded text was suppressed because it contained dangerous truth, we stop reading carefully. The book becomes useful before it becomes understood. It is turned into a weapon against authority, or a badge of special knowledge, or a shortcut to feeling awake while everyone else is asleep. That may be emotionally satisfying, but it is not wisdom. Enoch itself is more demanding. It does not flatter the hunger for forbidden things. It warns us about that hunger. In its own story, hidden knowledge enters the world through beings who have already betrayed their calling. The result is not liberation, but corruption. Weapons, enchantments, manipulation, violence, and pride spread through the human world like a stain. The book's most uncomfortable lesson is that not everything hidden is healing. Not every secret deserves to be opened with admiration, and yet, Enoch is also a book of revelation. That is the tension. It condemns corrupted knowledge while preserving heavenly knowledge. It shows secrets that destroy and visions that clarify. It does not tell us to remain ignorant. It tells us to ask what knowledge does to the soul that receives it. Does it make us more just, more humble, more truthful? Or does it make us intoxicated with the feeling of being among the few who know? This is why the Book of Enoch works so powerfully as a mirror. A scholar may see in it a crucial witness to ancient apocalyptic imagination. A believer may see a sacred tradition preserved outside familiar boundaries. A skeptic may see evidence of how religions form, compete, and exclude. A mystic may see a map of hidden worlds. A conspiracy theorist may see proof that authorities buried dangerous truths. The same text receives all of them and quietly reveals what each reader is looking for. That does not make all readings equal. Some are more careful than others. Some stay close to the evidence. Some drift quickly into fantasy. But the variety itself tells us something important. Enoch survives not only because it is old, but because it sits at the meeting point of several desires. The desire for justice, the desire for origins, the desire for hidden order, and the desire to believe that official history has not had the last word. The Templar legend enters this mirror for the same reason. People imagine the Templars protecting Enoch because the image satisfies a longing for continuity. It gives the book a guardian and the knights a secret worthy of their downfall. It turns historical uncertainty into a story with shape. The book was too dangerous, so someone hid it. The order knew too much, so someone destroyed it. The surviving fragments are clues, and the modern seeker becomes the one brave enough to connect them. It is a seductive story, but seduction is not the same as truth. What we can say with more confidence is simpler and more interesting. The Book of Enoch became magnetic because its absence from many traditions made people ask why absence matters. Its survival in Ethiopia disrupted the idea that Western canons told the whole story. Its contents challenged easy distinctions between scripture, legend, theology, and imagination. Its themes made later legends feel meaningful, even when the evidence was thin. In other words, the mystery is not only in the text, it is in the reaction to the text. Why do we assume hidden means true? Why do we trust a forbidden book more quickly than a familiar one? Why do we sometimes treat exclusion as proof of purity, when exclusion can also result from disagreement, caution, accident, language loss, or changing communal use? These questions matter because they reach far beyond Enoch. Every age has its forbidden shelves. Some contain voices that were unjustly silenced. Some contain ideas that were rejected for good reasons. Some contain writings that are valuable but not central. Some contain errors made fascinating by age. The difficult work is learning to tell the difference. That work requires more than suspicion. It requires patience. The Book of Enoch rewards patience. Read slowly. It becomes less like a stolen file from heaven and more like an ancient moral drama about responsibility. It asks what happens when power teaches without righteousness, when knowledge outruns conscience, when victims need a witness beyond the courts of the world. It asks whether judgment can reach upward into places where authority has become too confident in itself. That is why the book continues to feel dangerous. Not because it proves every legend attached to it. Not because it confirms that the Templars guarded it. Not because it overturns all religious history with a single hidden key. It feels dangerous because it unsettles complacency. It refuses to let power appear innocent simply because it is high. It refuses to let knowledge appear holy simply because it is secret. That is a rare combination. And perhaps that is what people have been protecting all along, even when they misunderstand the object in their hands. Not a coded manual, not a weapon against every institution, not a guaranteed doorway into lost truth, but a question that keeps returning in different forms. What kind of knowledge makes human beings better? And what kind only teaches them to become more skillful at falling? Chapter 16, What was really protected? So what in the end was really protected? Not by the Templars, at least not in any way the evidence can prove. The careful answer is that we do not have a reliable basis for saying the Knights Templar guarded the Book of Enoch. The legend is powerful, but the bridge is symbolic. It tells us what later generations wanted the Templars to be: custodians of dangerous memory, keepers of the book behind the book, witnesses against official history. But the historical survival of Enoch points somewhere else. It was protected by preservation. That may sound less romantic than knights carrying manuscripts through the smoke of a collapsing fortress, but it is more profound. A text survives when people continue to make room for it in their world, when they copy it, read it, translate it, teach it, place it among sacred writings, refuse, even without fanfare, to let it become silence. In that sense, what was protected was not only a manuscript, it was a question. The Book of Enoch kept alive a way of imagining evil as more than private failure. It saw corruption in systems of power, in heavenly rebellion, in knowledge used without moral restraint. It gave ancient communities language for a world where the violent seemed untouchable and the wounded needed a court beyond the visible one. It insisted that the highest powers could be judged. That idea is dangerous enough without inventing a vault. The Templar legend, for all its uncertainty, survives because it circles the same fear: that institutions can become corrupt while claiming to defend truth, that official memory may be incomplete, that the condemned may not always have been condemned for the reasons written in the record. These suspicions can be exaggerated, and often are. But they are not born from nothing. History has given people reasons to distrust power. The task is to keep distrust from becoming fantasy. Because once every absence becomes suppression, and every rumor becomes proof, the search for truth becomes another form of intoxication. The Book of Enoch warned about that long before modern secret histories existed. Hidden knowledge is not automatically wisdom. Sometimes the desire to possess the forbidden is part of the fall. So perhaps the real protected thing was not a secret doctrine. It was a tension. The tension between revelation and danger. Between memory and myth. Between evidence and longing. Between the need to question authority and the need to question our own appetite for mysteries that flatter us. The Book of Enoch survived empires, languages, canon boundaries, and the narrowing of religious memory. The Templars did not need to protect it for that story to matter. Its endurance came through a tradition that kept it alive when others did not. And its power comes from the fact that it still refuses to sit quietly in any single category. Scripture to some, Apocrypha to others, ancient witness, forbidden book, mirror. The deeper story is not that one order hid one text from one institution. It is that certain ideas are very difficult to bury. They pass through fragments, legends, translations, sermons, arguments, and misunderstandings. They survive because people keep needing them. Enoch's most enduring idea is not that angels fell. It is that power can fall. And when it does, someone must remember. Chapter 17. The Last Watcher in the Dark. In the end, the Book of Enoch leaves us with an image that is difficult to shake. A witness standing between worlds. Not a king, not a warrior, not the founder of an empire. A watcher of another kind. Enoch looks upward and sees order where the earth sees chaos. He looks downward and sees the damage left by beings who should have known better. His gift is not power in the ordinary sense. It is testimony. He remembers what violence wants forgotten. He records what authority would rather leave unnamed. That may be why the book survived so strangely in the human imagination. It is not only a story about fallen angels. It is a story about the fear that knowledge can corrupt, and the hope that truth can still be preserved. It warns that revelation without humility becomes poison. It also warns that institutions do not own all memory, and that a text can live beyond the borders drawn around it. The Templars may never have guarded Enoch. The evidence does not let us say they did. But the legend linking them tells us something real about the people who kept asking the question. We want to believe that dangerous truths have protectors. We want to believe that what was lost was not entirely lost. We want to believe that somewhere, at the edge of official history, a witness remained awake. In Ethiopia, the book did remain awake, not as a rumor in a medieval vault, but as a living text in a tradition that preserved it while much of the world forgot how to read it. That fact is quieter than the legend, but stronger. It reminds us that survival is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is devotional. Sometimes it is the patient work of copying a page because the page still matters. And so the final question is not whether Enoch proves every secret history attached to its name. It does not. The better question is why this book still unsettles us, perhaps because it turns suspicion in both directions. It challenges the powers that decide which voices are safe, but it also challenges the seeker who wants forbidden knowledge without responsibility. It asks whether humanity was corrupted by the secrets it received, or by the pride with which it used them. It asks whether the greatest danger is hidden truth, or the human appetite to possess truth without becoming worthy of it. That is a colder mystery than a conspiracy. It has no locked chamber, no final map, no order of knights waiting behind the curtain, only a text that should have vanished and did not. A book outside many Bibles, yet never fully outside memory. A witness from the edges of tradition, still speaking in the language of angels, judgment, and moral consequence. It tells us that power can fall, knowledge can wound, and records can outlive those who tried to control them. Somewhere in the dark of the story, Enoch is still writing, not to give us every answer, but to remind us that nothing hidden stays hidden forever, and not every revelation sets us free.